Welcome back to our series on Jeremiah and the Faithful Remnant, Surviving the Last Days. And we're looking at Jeremiah and his friends, and this is being sponsored by the Christadelphian video service. So we're going to look tonight at Jeremiah 36 and Jeremiah 45 because, as we've said all along, the chapters of Jeremiah are put in by the translators, not by God. And the book of Jeremiah needs to be resorted chronologically. And we're going to see that chapter 45 actually belongs between Jeremiah 36 verse 4 and Jeremiah 36 verse 5. And we're going to deal with it in that way. There's also another chapter that comes in between those two verses, which is chapter 25. And when you put it together in that order, you get the whole story. But we're going to talk about Jeremiah and his friend Baruch. The Jews call him Baruch, but I'll just call him Barak, which is the way we English tend to say it. The great lesson of Barak is how we can overcome times of sadness and depression. And we're going to see that Barak is a classic example of depression, and we're going to see how God deals with it. So we're now in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. And if ever there was a year to sadden and depress the faithful remnant that was with Jeremiah, it would be the 4th year of Jehoiakim, a year of great gloom. They've just had years of famine and dearth in the land in the previous 3 years. But this is the critical year because they had been depending upon Egypt to keep the Babylonians away. And unfortunately, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, Egypt lost the battle of Carchemish, and the Babylonians then had free rein to come into their land and to take Jerusalem. And so you can see these events mentioned in Jeremiah 46 verse 2. It talks about the 4th year of Jehoiakim was the year that the Egyptians lost that battle. And then in the book of Kings, it was in the 4th year of Jehoiakim that he came into Jerusalem. So we have the first invasion of the land. By this critical year, Jeremiah had now been prophesying for 22 years since he was commissioned by God. He'd been through 18 years with Josiah, and now is in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. Not one single prophecy that Jeremiah had made to this point before the battle of Carchemish, not one prophecy had come to pass. And so he'd been mocked, he'd been scourged, he'd been persecuted, derided. And they were saying to him over and over again, "Where is the word of Yahweh? Let it come now." And they were mocking him because no prophecy up until that point had come to pass. And now the Babylonians arrive at the gates of Jerusalem. And his words came to place with great sadness for that nation. This was the first time since the days of Samuel and the Philistines that the Jews lost their national independence. They now were placed under tribute by a foreign king. They were occupied by a foreign army. And they suffered enormously in these years under Jehoiakim. So you see, the 4th year of Jehoiakim was a very dreadful year for the fortunes of Israel. It was also the year that Daniel and his friends were taken into captivity to serve in the court of the king of Babylon, and many others were taken away by the Babylonians into captivity. It was a tragic year. Babylon began to dominate the world. They took away the cream of the land. The king's seed were taken away. And very sadly for Jeremiah, many of his Sunday school class come youth group were taken away as well and went into captivity. It was a tragic year. But also in this 4th year of Jehoiakim, other things were going on. We have the writing of the words of Jeremiah that we're going to read about in chapter 36, verse 1 and 2. Then we have the terrible final prophecy added to Barak's writings, chapter 25. And then we have the depression of Barak in Jeremiah 45. And so we have once we've put the records together, we have a very telling story about what's going on in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, a year of gloom. The important thing now about this is now that the Babylonians have arrived, now that the Egyptians have failed to defend Israel, Jeremiah's words are starting to be heard by some people with much more respect. They could no longer ignore him. Till the time had come for the words of Jeremiah to be written down. We're going to see that even some of the worst of the people in the land began to think that they should start listening to the words of Jeremiah. You've got Jeremiah 36 open. You read there about a man called Elnathan, the son of Akbor. Now, Elnathan was the king's father-in-law. He was the father of Nehushta, who we talked about earlier on. He had murdered Urijah the prophet, dragging him back from Egypt, a friend of Jeremiah's. And in verse 25, when the servants of the king are saying, you need to listen to these words of Jeremiah, even Elnathan is saying, please, Jehoiakim, listen to what Jeremiah is saying. So even the worst of the people, even the murderous Elnathan, he started to listen to Jeremiah. Many people were moved by the words of Jeremiah, as we're going to see. But one man wasn't moved, and that was the horrible King Jehoiakim. He was the one who burnt the scroll of Jeremiah. So let's now look at this man Barak. We'll see that God provided for Jeremiah a faithful friend and scribe. This man only appears in the record after the loss of Josiah. He only appears from the 4th of Jehoiakim onwards. He appears after the first captivity has taken place. Maybe he was the answer to the prayers of the lonely man Jeremiah. And I think particularly when many of his Sunday school class were taken away, that God provided a loyal friend who stayed with him for the rest of his time, in the rest of his life. Right to the very end, even in Egypt, Barak was still by his side. His name means the light of Yah. His brother Seraiah, described as a quiet prince or a honourable prince, was Zedekiah's scribe and went to Babylon with Zedekiah. It appears to have been a very godly family. And he was a man of some influence, because later on, when the people were rejecting the words of Jeremiah in chapter 43, they said, well, you're just being pushed around by Barak. And so he was a man of influence. He wasn't just a humble scribe who didn't have any opinion. He was perceived by the people to be an influence on Jeremiah. Later on, we're going to see that he also had a number of important roles in the nation. When the city had fallen, the Babylonians appointed 3 men to rule the city: Gedaliah the governor, Jeremiah and Baruch. So again, he was a capable administrator. He was Jeremiah's faithful scribe and companion for some 20 years and stayed with him right to the end in Egypt. He was the man that went out into the city and buried the title deeds to the block of land in Anathoth, which we read about in chapter 32. So he was very involved with Jeremiah for the rest of his life. So let's come now to Jeremiah 36 and to show you how this chapter must be divided up and how there must be insertions of 2 other chapters between verse 4 and 5. So here he is in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. He was commanded through Jeremiah to take a scroll and to write out all of Jeremiah's words that had been spoken to this point of time. So all of the words, all the prophecies of the first 22 years had to be written down into a scroll. And that's what Baruch had to do. So obviously Jeremiah was given recall of those words to actually make those speeches again, and they would be written down by the hand of Baruch. And that includes chapters 1 to 12, 14 to 20, chapters 23 and 26. They're all the chapters we know for sure are prior to the 4th year of Jehoiakim. So he would write them down. And this was an accumulation of the words of Jeremiah. The reason this had to be done was that in those days there were no recordings, there were no news broadcasts, there was no written record, there were no newspapers. And many of the people through the nation had not heard the words of Jeremiah firsthand. But now there would be copies made. Now these words could be read out in various places all over the land. And the words of Jeremiah would ring out through the whole nation because of the writing of Baruch. Well, that scroll was ultimately destroyed by the king Jehoiakim, and it had to be written out again. So at the end of this chapter, we find he's got to go write it all out again and to add a lot more words to it. Well, we do know that when he wrote it out the second time, he added chapter 25 to it. And so a last dreadful prophecy, chapter 25, is made and added to the words that were written out the second time. So this was a lot of writing for the scribe Baruch to go through. Now, just some interesting facts about this particular phase of the life of Jeremiah. Up until now, we've had Jeremiah speaking his own words, speaking in the first person. From here onwards, from chapter 36 onwards, or from the 4th year of Jehoiakim onwards, the whole of the life of Jeremiah is written as a biography. And it's obviously from a close observer. So Baruch was now walking alongside Jeremiah wherever he went, recording day by day the experiences that Jeremiah went through and the words that he spoke from this point onwards. So there's a very distinct change in the way the language of the book is written, from being in the first person of Jeremiah in those early chapters, now going into the third person in the case of Baruch's writing about Jeremiah's life. And the record includes many details that only a very close friend or associate would know about Jeremiah and his thoughts. So Baruch was right there recording this for our sakes. We also get chapter 45, which is a very humbling account of his own fears, his own thoughts that God has to challenge, and the counseling that came to him via Jeremiah from God himself. So here was the writings of Baruch the scribe. Remember, Jeremiah's been doing things for 22 years, performing parables, giving resounding speeches. But because there was no permanent record, it now was being written down by Baruch. He took this scroll, wrote out the judgments of Jeremiah, and it was done with hope. The hope was in verse 7. It may be that people will present their supplication, return from their evil ways, because anger and fury is hanging over them. So the intent was to cause people to repent. Well, you can imagine what it was like writing out all the speeches of Jeremiah at this point of time. And when chapter 25 was added in, it absolutely crushed Baruch's hopes of a national revival. I believe up to this point, Baruch was hoping that there would be a national revival, there would be a great restoration of hope for the nation, that God will sort out the Babylonians, and he, being the scribe who had caused this to happen through his writings, would be an honoured person. And it didn't happen. So when we go back to chapter 25, we actually have the chapter that was added in at the end of the writing of the words of Jeremiah. We need to go back there because it's very specifically included as part of it. So chapter 36 was in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. And then we read this, the word that came to Jeremiah. So this is a new prophecy in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, which was the first year of Nebuchadnezzar. So the first year under Nebuchadnezzar, this prophecy is given. So this is, while Baruch is writing out Jeremiah's words, a new prophecy is given. And here it is. And it actually, in verse 1, we have the dating of it. And then we go down to verse 13 for the timing of it. And it says this, and I will bring upon the land all my words which I have pronounced against it, says God, even all that is written in this book, which Jeremiah has prophesied against all the nations. You see, there is the proof that it was added to the words that Jeremiah had previously spoken. So in that same year that the scroll is being written, chapter 25 is added and is then included in the book of Jeremiah to that point of time. Now, we're not going to go through the whole chapter because it's a chapter of tremendous appeal as well as tremendous warning that the people must completely change their ways. So verse 8 to 9 is a prophecy of Babylonian invasion. Verse 11 to 12, a desolation of the land for 70 years, which was the first time that's ever mentioned. Verse 17 to 29, then a prophecy of the destruction the Babylonians will bring upon all the other nations of the Middle East. And then finally, we have an Armageddon section, a prophecy against the nations of all the earth. And you see that in verse 29, at the end of it, all the inhabitants of the earth. At the end of verse 30, all the inhabitants of the earth. In verse 31, a controversy with the nations and all flesh. Verse 32, nation to nation, the coasts of the earth. Verse 33, the end of the earth, the end of the earth. So there's no doubt that the end verses in verse 30 to 38 are something which is still yet future for us, because it's about how the Babylonian invasion is going to be repeated Armageddon, and the great slaughter that will follow as the word of and the punishment of God goes from nation to nation. So this prophecy of 25 against Israel and Judah and against all the nations of the current world at that particular time is going to have a tremendous repeat in the future. And that's all there in chapter 25 of Jeremiah, which was added to the words of Jeremiah written out by Baruch. So we need, don't we, to see how this fits in with it. Now, this very stark message, including chapter 25, precipitated Baruch's personal crisis. Let's go back to chapter 36 and pick it up, because the timing is critical. So back in Jeremiah 36, we read this. In verse 5, and Jeremiah said to him, I am shut up. So he was under house arrest. I cannot go to the house of Yahweh. Therefore you go and read in the scroll which you've written the words of my mouth on the fasting day. Well, when did he do that? Well, he did it in the 5th year, in verse 9. So the reading took place in the 5th year of Jehoiakim. So there's actually a loss of 9 to 12 months here. And this is critically important to what's happening to Baruch personally. By the time the reading took place, Nebuchadnezzar had come, humiliated Jehoiakim, taken the first captivity away, and put them under tremendously painful tribute, so that Jehoiakim had to impose great taxes upon the people. And the words of Jeremiah were now coming to pass with great rapidity on that nation. So what happened in that delay of that 9 to 12 months between the command that to write the scroll and the time to go and read it? What had happened to delay that reading? Well, it was the depression that Baruch went through. So we come now to chapter 45. And you notice again, in verse 1, the word that Jeremiah the prophet spake unto Baruch the son of Neriah, when he had written these words in a book or a scroll at the mouth of Jeremiah, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. So, having written out the words, added chapter 25, then there's about a 12-month delay before he reads them. Why? Well, because he went into a classic depression. In verse 1 here, when it says, when he had written, it's in the present tense in the Hebrew, which means while he was writing it. So you can imagine, can't you, as he's writing out these words, and he starts to imagine the horror that he's writing down from what Jeremiah has been saying, that it brought to him a great depression. And so God sent Jeremiah to him. God could have spoken directly to Baruch, but no, he chose to send Jeremiah. Jeremiah had been through similar times himself of great depression and sadness, as we've seen in previous chapters. He was quite fit and able to go and talk to Baruch. And when you read about what happened, we have the words that Jeremiah would understand. These were the words of Jeremiah in chapter 15. This great depression he had been through. He says in chapter 15, verse 17, I sat not in the assembly of them that make merry, nor rejoiced. I sat alone because of your hand. You filled me with indignation. Jeremiah had felt alone. He'd felt forgotten. He'd felt withdrawn. He knew what Baruch was going through. He was the right man to send. Now I want to talk about depression, because in chapter 45, we have God dealing with Baruch's depression and sadness. Every time I've given this talk, I inevitably receive some criticism because people think I'm interfering in the medical psychological process. I'm not medically trained, but I have had experience with a number of people who've been through Great Depression, done my research. What I want to present is a biblical perspective. I do recognise that some depression has physical causes and requires medication. I am not suggesting people disregard their medical advice. What I am saying is this: our God who made us is not unaware of our human weaknesses, and he provides ways for us to manage them. Sadness comes to everybody. Even Jesus thought to be alone when he heard of the death of John the Baptist. He said to his disciples, "Let us go apart for a time." As the cross loomed large before him, he began to be very heavy, says the record. He felt weighed down by the weight of responsibility and the pain and the suffering he knew was coming his way. We read of the Apostle Paul arriving at Athens alone, greatly concerned for the Thessalonians that he'd left behind in persecution, and the Philippians likewise. And he says, "I was there in weakness and fear and much trembling." We read of Paul in the depths of the Roman prisons, unable to deal with the problems that are happening all around the ecclesial world. It must have been very depressing for him indeed. And depression is a very widespread thing. It used to be called in days gone by a nervous breakdown. In Australia, they estimate that 1 in 24 people are suffering from depression of some kind. There's a tremendous cost in absenteeism and medical costs. It's amazing, isn't it, in an age of so many labour-free devices, that so many people are not coping with life. But our age, as we know, with all the technology around us, is mentally confusing, can be incredibly stressful, and there are so many unsolvable issues in the world. Our media is invasive, and in many workplaces there's a spirit of madness being adopted by our employers who are trying to appear as woke and keep up with the world around us. There are plenty of reasons for us to be feeling the pressure. But let's define what depression really is. As I said, some has a physical basis, and it may be due to some chemical imbalance, and I'm not going to go into the area because it's not my expertise. Sometimes depressive tendencies run in families. It can be an inherited susceptibility. But often the cause is unknown. And it can come suddenly to anyone. I want to make that point. It can come suddenly to anyone. It can afflict the meek and the confident alike. It can hit the dynamic as much as the introspective. It can hit the highly active as well as the creative. Depression plays no favourites. Don't think it could never be you. What we do know is that depression often follows great personal loss. It might be the grief of losing a relative. It might be the loss of employment. It might be a major crisis in our family or ecclesia, or tough times economically that we're going through. Depression can strike very suddenly and very unexpectedly, and it usually follows a time of emotional exhaustion. And when we talk about depression, it's not just a sad episode. We all have those. Depression is where we reach the point that we can't bounce back, where the episodes become a spiral of negativity and a sense of hopelessness descends upon us. It always contains a great sense of loss, and it can be very disconcerting to some to lose control of their life and their emotions. Let me talk about some of the manifestations of depression and sadness. One of the greatest manifestations is what we call the black hole experience. Winston Churchill coined the phrase the black dog, and of course he would normally cope with it with alcohol. But he had moments of great depression because of the ups and downs of his life, in and out of Parliament, in and out of ministries. But he always had this problem with depression. In Asaph, we find Asaph describes it as sliding down into a crevasse, unable to stop yourselves going down into despair. So the black hole experience, this morose sadness and gloom, is the great common thing about depression. It's followed by losing interest in and pleasure in life, finding nothing positive to rejoice or hope in. And so it dents the hope that we have in our faith. Feelings of agitation, or conversely lassitude or apathy. Some people get very highly strung and become quite irrational. OCD can be part of it. Other people just don't want to do anything. They want to sit around, lie in bed, and just feel apathetic. Very commonly, our sleep is affected one way or the other. Most common is tiredness. People feel, even though they've done nothing physical, they feel incredibly tired, but they can't sleep properly. And so they're awake all night, churning over the things that are bothering their mind. More depression symptoms are these. Poor eating habits. Some people won't eat and therefore lose weight. Other people eat excessively and gain weight, especially as they're not doing any exercise or going out. So again, it's a very, very vicious cycle. Well, this is the one which is perhaps the one which is the most painful of all. What comes with depression is that for even the most capable people, a sense of worthlessness and low self-esteem, feeling that they are no good to anyone, they might as well die, and suicidal thoughts often enter in at this stage. Depressed people cannot concentrate or focus, and they have a poor memory. They often get their facts confused, their history confused, and they cannot even read a book because they just can't concentrate or focus. And therefore, they avoid pressure or decision-making. The phone ringing can set them off into alarm and panicking. Having to make decisions is almost impossible when you're going through depression. Introversion. This one we're going to see comes out in the case of Bayak, consuming self-pity. Woe is me. We're going to see that in verse 3, God feeds back the words of Bayak saying, woe is me, woe is me. And it becomes a very self-centered, consuming self-pity when we are thoroughly depressed. When we're depressed, we're driven by feelings rather than by reason. And that, of course, is always a great danger because their feelings and their emotions are not stable. This one I found particularly common in people that I've tried to help. Wanting love, but wanting to be alone. You ring them up and say, can I take you out? Can I come around? No, I just want to be left alone. And so you oblige them and you hang up and you don't go. And that just makes their depression worse. Just a little note of experience from that. Don't ask if you can come, just turn up. They want to be loved, but they'll tell you they want to be alone. And it's not uncommon for people who are depressed because they are mentally down, their body goes down with them, and psychosomatic illnesses follow. They start then to imagine even things that are not happening to their body. But the overwhelming thing is this sense of hopelessness, this loss of purpose, this loss of meaning, the loss of value for themselves. Now, before I move on to talk about how God deals with it, I want to just show you from the Bible that this is not a new thing. It's not just a new phenomenon, even though in the modern world we recognize it and we actually define it much better than the ancient world did. Number one is this. It is not a sin to be depressed. I want to say it again. It is not a sin to be depressed. Being depressed is not the evidence of a lack of faith. Our God knows the frailty of our frame. And so he's recorded a number of very faithful characters in the Bible who go through times of great sadness and depression. You think of Hannah. She was a woman of great faith. She wanted the fortunes of Israel to be restored. But she was falling apart inside because of her childlessness. Look at the manifestations that we find with Hannah. A constant weeping, a loss of appetite, a wanting to be alone, refusing help that was offered by her husband, a withdrawal to be alone in the temple, a very strong focus on her own problem. She said, I am bitter of soul. You see, that's classic depression. And refused comfort and assurance that was offered by her husband. So, Hannah was a classic case of somebody who went through a major depression. And we know that God gave her a great answer to her depression in the giving of Samuel. But before we leave Hannah as an example, just think about the story you know so well and what happened. Because in this case, we have a great example of how not to help somebody who's depressed. And it comes from the well-intentioned Elkanah, her husband. He was concerned for her because she was not eating, she was always crying. And he makes a classic mistake in his frustration with her. And he says this, am I not better than 10 sons? Well, to put it in modern language, I can't see why you should be depressed. You've got me. Well, in Israel, a childless woman was regarded as being a failure. It was no comfort to her watching Peninnah with the children of her husband. For him to say, you've got me, was a very bitter pill indeed. And then Eli mistakes her grief for drunkenness. In the end, she put the matter in God's hands. So, be careful about how you try and help people. We're going to show at the end some things that we need to take on as we try and help those who are depressed. Let's talk about another person who was depressed. Come to Job chapter 23 and pick it up in verse 8 to 10. Because Job went through a very terrifying experience with the loss of his children and his possessions. And one of the statements of Job in Job 23, verse 8 to 10, tells us about his confusion about what God was doing in his life. And it reads like this, behold, I go forward, but lo, he's not there. And backward, and I can't perceive him. On the left hand where he doth work, but I cannot behold him. He hideth himself on the right hand, that I cannot see him. So Job is confused. I can't find what God's doing with me in these trials. But he's still confident. But he knoweth the way that I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. So there's a very understandable sense of hopelessness and gloom. You've only got to read his words in Job chapter 3 to see how low that he got. He wished he'd never been born. But he comes out a better person with a much deeper view of God. When we go to the life of David, we see the full cycles of human emotion, of guilt, of loneliness, of fear, of a persecution complex. In so many Psalms, we see David working through those feelings of depression, those feelings of loneliness. In Psalm 73, we have Asaph, a classic case of depression. He felt he was slipping away into the great gloom and into the pit of despair. His feet were almost gone. That's a very common experience of those who are going through depression. And we could quote you lots of others like Jonah and John Mark and Paul and King Saul at the early stage of his life, going through depression. Let's talk about Elijah, because here is the classic case in the Bible of a highly motivated, zealous individual who could rise to great heights of faith and then could crash into depths of despair. Now think what happened after the incredible miracle on Mount Carmel. Running before the chariot of Ahab, rain pouring behind them as he goes down the valley of Jezreel. And when he gets there, the words of Jezebel frighten him to death. Let's pick up the record in the 1st of Kings chapter 19. It's amazing, isn't it? The transformation of the powerful, dynamic Elijah when he comes face to face with the completely unrepentant, arrogant Jezebel. And he collapses into depression because of it. Now let's notice what he says. In verse 3, and when he saw the threat of Jezebel, he was depressed. And we know that because what's the first thing he does? He wants to be alone. So he sends his servant away. Why would you do that? You see, this is the classic side of depression. I want to be left alone. And then he went for himself a day's journey. He's now running away. He's now not worried about what God wants him to do. He's now doing things for himself. He's becoming self-absorbed. Then in verse 4, we have this sense of worthlessness. He's hiding in a cave. Or firstly, under a juniper tree. And his hopes are all dashed. And the classic symptoms in verse 5, withdrawn from supporters, got a loss of appetite, and he's sleepy. He just lies down to sleep under this juniper tree. And he's saying, I am no better than my fathers. I'm useless. I'm worthless. And God sends an angel to provide for him. Now this lasted for 6 weeks. He was still morose and bitter all the way to Horeb. Took him a long time to get there. He was tired. He had no energy. A man that had run before the chariot of Ahab's got no energy. So he goes part of his journey and then he sleeps. Part of his journey and then he sleeps. And the angel keeps him alive by providing food for him all of this 6-week journey down to Horeb. Where's the dynamic prophet now? This sense of being alone. I only am left. And they sit life away. And he says, look, you take my life. And he's got suicidal thoughts, as well as fears that they're going to destroy him. He's got no sense of worth anymore. And his reply to God was accusing God of not caring, of being unreasonable. One of the things about depression is that much of our reasoning becomes illogical, which is why we need to have it fed back to us. Where was the positive thoughts about the raised child at Zarephath, about the ravens, the fire from heaven, about Obadiah, the rain, the answer to his prayers? Where were those positive things? They were lost in the black hole of depression. So you see, there are many Bible examples telling us that this is not something new. Let's go back to Barak now in Jeremiah 45 and see how God deals with depression. And that's the critical thing. You will find any number of books, any amount of advice out there on how we can cope with depression. But I want to show you how God deals with Barak's depression, because it's the only counseling session we have in the scripture. Well, God, who knows the human mind, knows what to say. Unfortunately today, some of our psychiatrists are very humanistic. They love to create people to become victims. And unfortunately, some of them like to blame religion as being part of the problem. Much of the advice of modern day psychiatrists is you need to look after yourself first, or to take more drugs, or go to therapy. And none of them provide a spiritual component as part of the process of recovery. So let's look at what God does. These are God's steps to recovery. Well, the first step, when you're counseling a person who is depressed, is feedback. So you take their own words, their own statements, and you feed them back. Now, the very typical symptoms are here. God says in verse 2, Barak, this is what I hear you saying. Now, this is feedback. So, God through Jeremiah is saying, Barak, I have heard what you are saying in private. And this is what it is. You're saying, woe is me. Now, for Yahweh has added to my grief, to my sorrow. I fainted in my sighing, and I find no rest. So look at that. I want you to just, in verse 3, just colour in the I, the me, and the my, and it's very self-centered. There's a consuming self-pity here. He starts off with the word woe. His name means blessed. Barak means blessed. He says, woe is me. So a complete transformation of the meaning of his name. He's got sorrow, he's got grief, he's got sighing, he can't sleep. And you see, there's nothing in that verse 3 about how God's feeling about the situation. There's no solution here. There's no prophet being seen at all. It's all about depression. So when we are feeling depressed, it's very useful to hear what we're actually saying. Remember what God did with Elijah. What are you doing here, Elijah? And he made him repeat it, before and after the earthquake, the fire, and the still small voice. What are you doing here, Elijah? And you see, God is trying to get us to face our own words. Because in doing so, we see where we have exaggerated or overrated the issues. Careful feedback will help us to begin to articulate our own solution. So in giving feedback, what do you mean by that? Why did you say that? Well, why do you think these people don't like you? Why is it that you're letting this get on top of you? So feedback actually is the first step. Make people say what they're expressing. Well, step number 2 is a reality check. This is what God said to Barak. Barak, your problem is You're seeking great things for yourself. Seek them not. For behold, I will bring evil upon all flesh, says Yahweh. What I'm going to give you is I'm going to spare your life. You see, Barak had hoped that his writings would change the nation. There would be a great revival, and he would be promoted because of what he had done for the nation using the words of Jeremiah. And God's aware of his motives. And God says, Barak, some things will not change. You're distressed now because the nation's going to be shattered. It's going to be shattered, Barak. It can't change. It's going to get worse than what it is now. It's all going to go. The nation, the people, the temple, it's all going to go. He doesn't soften the blow. He doesn't say, oh, it'll all be all right. No, he says, Barak, it's going to get worse. Maybe Barak had possessions. He certainly had ambitions. Like all Jews, he had national pride. He revolted at the idea of the Babylonians destroying his nation. Maybe he wanted to get promotion. Whatever it was, he was seeking great things for himself. He had to learn the lesson. Barak, life is hard. Life can be disappointing, but there's work to be done. There are many people who suffer depression from unreal expectations. The modern world promotes so many false images. The advertising industry uses all kinds of strategies to get us to buy things and to believe that happiness comes from the things that you own. That life's all about fun and self-satisfaction. But the reality is different. People follow after those things and get mired in debt they can't pay. They lose relationships chasing money. They end up frustrated and so get depressed. And it's no different for those of us in the truth. We are not promised unfettered happiness, easy times. There will be conflicts within and without as we try to raise spiritual thinking. In the last days, there will be disappointments and defections from the truth. There will be false prophets leading some away. Like Jeremiah, we have to try and save the remnant. Like Elijah, we have to go looking for the 7,000 who've not bowed the knee to the world in which they live. So step 2 is a reality check. Things may not improve. We have to cope with the reality that we're faced with. Well, step number 3 is a focus on gratitude. Let's think about the focus on gratitude. You see, Barak had been promised in verse 7 that his life would be given him for a prey. It's very similar to what we read in chapter 15 and verse 11, where God had said to Jeremiah that his remnant would be preserved from harm. It's a common phrase that's repeated in chapter 21, verse 9, 38, verse 2, and chapter 39, verse 18, in every case to Jeremiah and his friends. So God promises that though you go through great sufferings, you will not be killed, even though you'll have many frightening experiences. It comes under this metaphor of your life for a prey that we read about in verse 5 of Jeremiah 45. And that's a Hebrew metaphor. We've all seen the BBC films on nature, how the lions pursue a little antelope across the plains in Africa. The little antelope is madly running, twisting and turning, knocked down, gets up and keeps running, scrambles away, finally gets into the bushes, panting and terrified, scarred, but alive. And that's the Hebrew metaphor. Barak, you'll go through terrible things, but in the end, you'll get your life for a prey. And Barak had to see, like we all have to see, that life this side of the kingdom is a tapestry of good and evil. Let's be grateful for the promises and blessings we do have, for forgiveness and grace that we have, for the hope of Israel that we have, for companions in the faith that we have, for the care of the angels that we are promised, for our spiritual understanding that helps us to see the world for what it really is. You see, that's the way God restored Barak. Feedback. Face the reality. count your blessings. So I want to talk now about the ways we can best help people going through sadness and depression. I want to talk to carers first. When it falls to us to try and help somebody in depression, there are some rules we need to follow. Number one, don't despise depression. If it's never happened to us or to a member of our family, then we might think that people are just putting it on or that they're weak. Well, if Elijah and Hannah and David suffered depression, they were not weak people. So don't be unsympathetic. It happens to the most active and dynamic people you could imagine. It's a complex illness. It takes a long time to heal. There are no magic cures. It is no good to say to somebody, just snap out of it. Just read your Bible, because willpower will not solve it. It needs a refocusing of the mind on what life is really about and what God and his ways really are. So there must be no despising of it. It has to be dealt with sensitively. There must be practical support and patience in understanding it. Recovery from depression is always gradual, and there will be relapses. It needs time. Sometimes it's important just to be there. Keep contact with messages, cards, phone calls, dropping a meal around. Think of the angel who patiently cooked for Elijah for 6 whole weeks, waking him up and sending him on the journey and then waiting for him at the next time that he stopped. There was a case in our country where a brother was incredibly depressed, associated with grief and other things that have happened in his life. And he just said, I want to be alone. But a very faithful brother from his meeting said, well, look, I understand you don't want to talk. Can I just come and sit with you to make sure you're okay? Because, you're sometimes suicidal. So can I just come? I'll bring a book to read and I'll just sit and read to make sure you're okay. And he did that for weeks on end. And the book he brought, of course, was a pioneer work. And he sat there reading. And every so often he would turn to the brother who was on the bed and say, well, I read something interesting. And he'd give him a point from the book. And eventually the brother came good. But you see, he sat there for a long time, just like the angel did with Elijah. You have to listen and give feedback. You don't lecture depressed people. You don't add in your own worries and experiences. You don't say to them, I know what that's like. This happens in my family. That's not going to help them. One of the least helpful things with a depressed person is to talk about yourself. As much as we all love to do just that, it's not helpful. What we've got to do is to listen to what they are saying and provide sensitive feedback. Remember what God did with Elijah? What are you doing here, Elijah? And to Barak, it's not going to get any better. I hear you saying this. Do you really mean that? You see, what it does is careful feedback starts a self-corrective process. It makes them rethink the extreme things that they're saying in their depression. On the road to Emmaus, Jesus came across 2 very sad people. Why are you so sad, he said. And he got them to express their feelings about their sadness. So listen carefully and provide useful feedback. And when you get them to think about what they've said, just keep plugging away and unpick it. Well, the next thing is empathize, but don't indulge. And here's somewhere where God's wisdom and modern psychology tends to diverge. Realities have to be faced. Sometimes circumstances will not change. I've had psychiatrists tell people I know, you have a right to stay depressed. You can stay depressed until others repent and change their ways. You must look after yourself first. But God doesn't say to Bayak, you can remain depressed. He says, get out there and read the words you've written down. He does require us to go on. Jeremiah, you're depressed about the loss of Josiah. Now you're going to have to run with horses like Jehoiakim. No one is spared the hard tasks of life. So empathise, but don't indulge. And open the scriptures and feed the spirit mind. It's very typical in times of depression to neglect the best source of comfort and wisdom when life is tough. We need to encourage spiritual input in any way that we can. Asaph, when he got to the end of Psalm 73 and looked back upon his experience, said, "It is good for me to draw nigh unto God." We have to keep trying, keep coming. Carers need to know how to speak a word in season to those who are weary and cast down and depressed. And there are many ways to gently feed in the scriptural mind. Never make hasty judgments. Remember Eli accusing Hannah? Remember Job's friends, loyal but wrong? He called them miserable comforters because of their hasty judgments. They didn't say right things about God. Be very careful of the tendency to interpret providence for the wounded soul. I've seen some terrible examples of this being done to people. Well, the reason this happened to you was, and then some old crotchet comes out or some old bitterness surfaces. Never make hasty judgments about why people are depressed. Elihu, in the case of Job and his friends, took the right approach. He listened carefully to what Job said. He then gave Job feedback. "Job, you're saying this, this, and this." And he fed back his own words. And then he said, "Well, look at it from God's perspective. Look at the big picture, Job." And in so doing, he prepared Job for God's intervention. So there's some advice for those who are carers of the depressed. Well, let's talk about some advice for the depressed. It's important for all of us to actually go through these steps because you never know that one day it might be you. If you haven't got some strategies that you've thought about, then you're going to need lots of help. But there are things we can do when depression comes our way. Well, I'm going to give you a bit of advice that I found from someone who'd been into the black hole and come out of it. And they said this. They said, there will be no coming out. There will be no coming out of the depths as long as we prefer to stay in them. In other words, sometimes going into our shell can be a comfort zone. It can be a way of avoiding the responsibilities that we have. So there must be a desire to get out of the black hole, a desire to come out of the depths. Okay, well, here are the steps that we need to go through. Number one, let the feelings come out. Don't keep it internalized. You see, what that does, when we internalize the feelings, they become a consuming self-pity. It is better to rage against God like Jeremiah has done in chapter 15 and chapter 20 and chapter 17 and many other places. It's better like Job to make a bitter complaint as he did in chapter 3. It's better to lay it all before God, even though we might feel that God has been very unfair to us. We need to express it to caring friends who can hear this in confidence and help us unpick it as to where it's wrong in its reasoning. And never think that we're the only ones who have gone through something like this. So number one, if ever we find ourselves depressed, be willing to talk and to get help. Number two, to pray for help, particularly when in trouble. Asaph in Psalm 73 went into the sanctuary. James says, is any sad? Let them pray. You know, Paul prayed 3 times over his illness. Christ went to Gethsemane and said, Father, what shall I pray for? It doesn't matter if it's a confused prayer. Prayer is not easy when we're depressed. That's why we need to have a conviction to try before we go into that state of depression. Never think we have to wait until our thoughts are correctly structured into an eloquent prayer. God hears the distress prayers as much as he hears the eloquent ones. We're going to deal in a later session with Lamentations chapter 3, where Jeremiah relives his process through depressive thoughts to returning to spirituality. Jeremiah had been through many stages where he tried to resign from the work that God gave him to do. Every time God said, Jeremiah, get back to work. Jeremiah, go on to do this. We must go on continuing to do the things that God requires us to do, including prayer. Accept the reality, things might not change. Job would always miss the children he'd lost. Elijah had to be taken away from the scene of Israel for quite a time that he might learn what was really important. Not fly from heaven, but the still small voice. Things did not get better when he was taken away. You see, we have to accept the reality. Barak was told, Barak, it's all going to go. It's not going to be saved. But you go on believing in God. In the end, God will wipe away all tears from the eyes of his faithful servants. So accept the realities of life. We cannot change everything. Then we must count our blessings and express gratitude to God for them. A wise man said this, all happy people are first grateful people. Even in the dark hours, we must recall God's love shown to us in the death of his Son, the promise of his care, the faithful friends he surrounds us with, our family, and the promises and the joy set before us. We must count our blessings. And then we come to what I think is perhaps one of the greatest steps to get out of depression. Look outwardly and think of others. There are others suffering too. They need us to remain strong. In the case of Asaph, it was the thought of what he might do to his family, his friends, and all those in Israel who looked up to him were he to go public with his depression. You see, we must think of those who depend on us. Under huge pressure, Jesus spent his last hours praying for others. Paul in prison was full of concern and care for the ecclesial world. Elijah was told to focus on the 7,000 who need you. One of the best remedies for sadness and depression is to start helping other people who are worse off. When I was a young man, I was invited by some older brethren to accompany them to have memorial meetings with an old brother who was dying in hospital of a disease that was taking away his legs piece by piece. I thought I would go along and just help the poor old fellow, but I learned some incredible lessons from him and his faith and his love of the pioneer writings. And it reminded me of the saying which says, a man was angry because he had no shoes until he met a man with no feet. And this particular brother inspired me by his faith in the spite of a terrible affliction that was eventually to take his life. And we have to keep active, keep involved in something, focus on God, his purpose and his love for us. And we do that by looking after God's people. Even the world's psychiatrists recommend this as a very necessary part of overcoming depression. Find some things you enjoy doing. Pursue an interest or a hobby. But be passionate about something. Even better, get out and amongst other people and help them. This is especially true in the household of faith. There are so many opportunities to serve other people. I had an uncle who'd been a prisoner of war in World War II, suffered enormously from depression and post-traumatic stress for the rest of his life. But when he came back to the truth after leaving it for many years due to his PTSD, he was a very skilled craftsman and he undertook tremendous transformation work on the whole because he could work there on his own during the day, during the week. And the passion that he gained from that overcame his depression and was able to return and face people in the meeting. You know, being useful and being in contact with other people really enhances our perspective about life. We have a sister in South Australia who lost a son to a terrible illness. Her way of coping was to put in many years of labour on our Christadelphian campsite, cleaning, gardening, spring cleaning, ordering supplies. That was her way of coping with her grief, doing something constructive. Was a sister in America, wheelchair-bound, who by putting ads in the papers and correspondence opened up the truth in the Philippines, and there are now approaching 1,000 members in that place. It might be just writing to people who are sick or the elderly, doing some preaching of some sort. The benefits of feeling useful are enormous in climbing out of the pit of despair. And so Barak refocused himself. Came to pass in the 5th year of Jehoiakim, he read the book of the words of Jeremiah in the presence of the people. He read it in the temple. He put himself in great danger. He was to be persecuted by Jehoiakim because of this. He identified with the unpopular words of Jeremiah of doom and destruction. He gave up all hopes of personal promotion and influence that he might have had. And he joined Jeremiah in fear of his life, because Jehoiakim tried to kill them both. And the king persecuted Jeremiah, and he burnt the scroll of Barak. You know, when the scroll had been read in the presence of the king, despite his attendants suggesting he listen, Jehoiakim's policy is, I will not hear. It's been that policy from his youth, and so he burnt the scroll of Barak. And he had to rewrite it again. Verse 28, he wrote the scroll and added many more words. You see, Barak now was achieving great things, not of his own personal promotion, but the great things that God wanted him to do for the word of God and for the truth in those days. He was preserved through the fall of Jerusalem and finally went to Egypt to support the aged Jeremiah. He inspired the remnant, both then and now, to keep the words of God faithfully and to diminish not a word. But above all, Barak shows us the path out of sadness and depression, to regain his courage, to be active, to get out there and to take on the evil Jehoiakim by the words of Jeremiah. Why don't you leave a conclusion with you? Again, there's some very powerful words I found in reading up on this subject. And it's based upon Lamentations 3, which we'll deal with in our last study. Depression is not a sign that God has abandoned us. You see, depressed people think, why has God let this or that happen to me? Why doesn't God care about me? You can easily think that God has abandoned us. No, brethren and sisters, through much tribulation we shall enter the kingdom of God. Those who are exercised by the chastening of the Father will go into the kingdom. Depression is not a sign that God has abandoned us. It's more likely a sign that God is getting to work on us for our ultimate good. Let us learn from Barak.